People often confuse kindness with weakness. They look at someone who feels deeply, someone who listens carefully, someone who gives from the heart, and they assume that this person must be soft, naive, or easy to break. But they forget something important, something that history, stories, and human behavior teach us again and again. The most dangerous people are not the ones who start out cruel. They're the ones who were pushed beyond their limit. Compassion isn't fear, it's controlled strength. That's what many people fail to understand, especially those who depend on manipulation or control to feel powerful. We live in a world that often labels sensitivity as fragility. Empaths are often dismissed as too emotional, too gentle, too delicate to live in what some call the real world. But that idea is deeply wrong. It has no real insight. It has no depth. Because what looks like softness from the outside is often a form of remarkable inner power, a power that chooses peace instead of force, understanding instead of judgment, and patience instead of dominance. The empath's way of surviving isn't based on fear. It's based on discipline. It takes an incredible amount of inner control to feel everything so intensely and still stay calm, to hold room for someone else's pain while carrying your own, to try to understand the whole picture instead of reacting to hurt. That is not weakness. Weakness reacts instantly. It attacks. It tries to control through fear or pressure. But compassion is intentional. It chooses to understand not because it ignores the harm, but because it sees the human truth behind it. A narcissist, however, interprets the empath's patience as an open door for abuse. They see the giving nature and assume it's endless. They think the silence is surrender, the kindness is neediness, and the patience is inability. What they don't see is that an empath is always evaluating, always measuring the emotional cost of their response. They choose again and again to rise above, not because they can't fight, but because they know how much damage fighting back can cause. Damage to themselves, to others, and to the fragile sense of peace they try to protect. This is where the narcissist's entire plan starts to fall apart. The narcissist believes in dominance and power for the sake of ego. But the empath believes in truth. And truth doesn't shout. It doesn't push. It doesn't try to humiliate. Truth simply stands and waits. The empath gives people the space to reveal who they really are. And eventually, the narcissist always shows their real nature. They push too much. They manipulate one time too many. They repeat the same harmful pattern. And the empath, though hurt, is not blind. They recognize the shift. And once they truly see it, they begin to pull away. Not from fear, but from strength. Controlled strength is the most powerful kind. It's the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. The empath isn't trying to win a fight. They are trying to protect their spirit. They don't walk away because they're incapable of staying. They walk away because they refuse to become like the one who harmed them. And that's something the narcissist never understands. They think real power is making others bend. But true power is standing tall while someone tries to break you. True power is restraint when provoked. True power is knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to. That choice is the heart of compassion. Compassion shaped by pain, refined by silence, strengthened by experience. It isn't blind. It isn't soft in the way people think. It's mature. Empaths learn slowly and often painfully where their boundaries are and where others must be held accountable. They learn the difference between empathy and losing themselves. They learn to stop trying to save people who are determined to stay harmful. And when they understand that, they become unshakable. A fed-up empath isn't chaotic. They don't explode. They don't shout. They don't try to prove a point. They become steady, calm, and certain. And that's what makes them dangerous. Not to the world, but to those who confuse their silence for weakness. They won't play the same emotional games. They won't justify themselves. They won't try to repair the damage someone else caused. They simply leave, not because they're escaping, but because they've already won the hardest battle inside themselves. The strength to choose peace over conflict. The strength to walk away without needing revenge. The strength to witness someone's darkness and still protect their own light. Empaths may break when ignored, but they evolve when betrayed. And that difference matters more than people realize. Being ignored wears down someone's sense of worth, especially someone who leads with openness and care. Empaths crave connection, not because they're needy, but because they feel deeply. They notice shifts in energy, changes in tone, silent tension in a room. When someone ignores them, it's not just quiet, it's a void that pulls at their instinct to understand, to fix, to soothe, to discover what went wrong. But betrayal is different. Betrayal cuts clean and deep. It strips away illusions. Betrayal doesn't whisper, it shouts. It shouts that the connection the empath believed in was built on false promises. It destroys the excuses they made to protect someone else's image. It tears down the hope that someone could change. Betrayal doesn't break the empath's identity. It breaks the illusion they were holding on to. And that moment becomes the beginning of their awakening. Because betrayal only comes from someone you trusted, defended, or let into your soul. Betrayal shows the empath how far they stretch themselves to hold on to a dream of who the other person could be, how often they blamed themselves, how long they sacrificed their peace. But betrayal is so sharp and undeniable that it shatters every excuse. It creates a break so deep that the empath cannot return to who they were. That is where their transformation begins, not because of the pain alone, but because they finally stop lying to themselves. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It starts in grief. Not only grief for the relationship, but grief for the version of themselves that accepted so little. They grieve the hope they held, the chances they gave, the nights spent replaying conversations, the days spent shrinking themselves to keep peace. But through that grief comes clarity, a clarity earned through experience, a clarity that cannot be taught, only lived. The empath realizes their depth was never the problem. Their sensitivity wasn't the issue. The real problem was giving their light to someone who only wanted to drain it. That truth hits hard, but it's also freeing. They no longer carry guilt for someone else's actions. They no longer ask, what should I have done? They begin to ask, why did I accept that behavior for so long? That shift marks the rebirth. Transformation starts quietly. The empath begins reclaiming space in their mind, heart, and spirit. They start setting boundaries that once felt impossible. They stop over-explaining. They stop apologizing for having needs. They stop compressing themselves to fit into someone else's comfort. They stop seeking validation from the person who hurt them. They turn towards self-respect, not arrogance. Self-respect earned through struggle. And that self-respect becomes a compass for everything that follows. Betrayal becomes a kind of alchemy in the hands of an empath. It turns pain into understanding. It turns wounds into wisdom. It doesn't make them cold, it makes them careful. They don't stop feeling. They choose where to place those feelings. They protect their energy. Not because they fear people, but because they know not everyone deserves their compassion. And slowly they become someone others hardly recognize. Not because they changed into someone new, but because they finally returned to who they truly were. But I believe not all empaths become destructive or frightening. Most are simply scared at first, and that's normal, but eventually they grow into someone others no longer underestimate. They speak less, but their words carry more weight. They give less, but what they give is chosen with purpose. They show up for themselves first. They stop trying to save people who prefer to drown. They learn to walk alone if needed to protect their peace. They stop basing their worth on whether someone else can recognize it. They stop chasing, stop explaining, stop repairing what they didn't break. They let people reveal themselves, and this time they believe what they see. The narcissist mixes up patience with permission, and that mistake destroys them. They assume calmness means acceptance. They assume silence means surrender. But patience isn't the absence of awareness. It's the presence of self-control. Empaths notice everything. They aren't blind. They're observing every inconsistency, every manipulation, every insult wrapped as humor. They hold back not because they don't understand, but because they want to understand fully. Empaths lead with understanding. They want to believe in someone's potential. They want to allow space for healing. So they stay. They endure. They justify red flags. They rationalize lies, gaslighting, and unpredictable moods, not because they're unaware, but because they hope for better. This is where the narcissist thinks they've found an advantage. They think patience means permission, that empathy means submission, but it's not. It's restraint. And restraint is powerful. Empaths have a kind of inner discipline people rarely see. They can be hurt again and still offer kindness. They can be disappointed and still show up. They function from emotional depth, not weakness. They recognize the roots of human behavior, the pain behind actions, the trauma behind patterns. They try to meet people wherever they are, even if that place is messy. But their compassion has limits. What the narcissist doesn't understand is that each act of disrespect, each manipulation, each moment of being taken for granted is stored, not as resentment, but as truth. Empaths think inwardly. They may not react right away, but they do not forget. They collect those moments quietly until one day they realize the pile has become a wall they can no longer see over. And when that moment comes, the connection shifts permanently. Their empathy moves away from the narcissist and returns to themselves. Their patience, once used to keep the relationship together, now protects their own spirit. This is when the narcissist begins to lose their grip. Their power depended on the idea that the empath's tolerance was endless. The why counted on forgiveness without change. They counted on the empath's reluctance to give up on people. But when the empath finally sees the pattern clearly, when they realize their compassion became a tool for control, everything inside them shifts. Their priority changes. They stop trying to preserve the relationship and start trying to preserve themselves, and the narcissist who relied on their old reactions finds themselves lost. They don't know how to respond to silence that isn't afraid, to boundaries that hold firm, to distance that doesn't seek answers. They try to provoke, but nothing happens. They try to guilt trip, but it no longer works. They try to return with false promises, but the door is already closed. The very patience they abused becomes the reason they lose, because it gave the empath enough time to understand everything, enough time to detach, enough time to reclaim their strength. This is the fatal mistake. The narcissist mistook character for compliance. They confused decency for weakness. They thought they were playing a strategic game with someone who didn't know the rules. But the empath knew the rules, they just weren't trying to compete, they were trying to comprehend. And now that comprehension is complete, the game ends. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with quiet, steady silence. A silence that carries finality. A silence that closes the chapter. A silence that reflects the truth. Patience was a gift, and once misused, it becomes the last gift ever offered. When an empath pulls away emotionally, it isn't coldness, it's understanding. It's one of the most wrongly interpreted shifts in human behavior. People think the empath has become bitter or hardened or unkind. But the truth is, this detachment is a careful response to repeated emotional harm. It's not impulsive. It's not theatrical. It's soft, slow, and unavoidable. The empath who once felt everything intensely begins to feel differently, not from lack of a heart, but from the presence of wisdom. Empaths start relationships with open hearts and open trust. They offer honesty before it is earned. They forgive easily and hold on longer than most. But this generosity has a price. While they are working to understand others, very few try to understand them. They carry other people's moods. They absorb unspoken pain. They stay in dark emotional corners trying to light them up with their own warmth. And for a while, they believe their effort is enough, until the moment it isn't. When they give and receive little back, when they listen but are rarely heard, when their care is used without returned effort, something inside them shifts. At first, they question themselves. They ask if they're being dramatic, too sensitive, or too demanding. They pull back to keep peace. They justify the distance. They explain away coldness. But with each cycle, their inner tension grows. They're not unaware, they're just hopeful. But hope runs out when it keeps hitting the same wall. And when it breaks, clarity arrives, sharp and unmistakable. This clarity doesn't come from anger. It comes from fatigue, from trying too hard, explaining too much, shrinking too often, and bending until they barely recognize themselves. The empath doesn't suddenly become hardened. They become aware, piece by piece, moment by moment. They arrive at a point where they can no longer carry what's hurting them. It happens when their care meets entitlement, when their honesty meets manipulation, when their vulnerability becomes ammunition, and one day they just stop, not with shouting, but with certainty. They stop fighting for a bond where truth is unwelcome. They stop explaining themselves to someone determined to misunderstand. They stop waiting for apologies that will never be sincere. Their detachment isn't emotional absence. It's emotional protection. It's the moment they gather back the energy that's been drained from them. And when that happens, it's not emptiness. It's healing. The narcissist usually reacts with confusion. They mistook the empath's patience for dependence. They assumed the empath needed them too much to leave. They never understood that emotional detachment is the final stage, not the first. It happens when hope has been worn out, when understanding has been tested, when forgiveness has been stretched too far. The empath no longer waits for the narcissist to change. They accept the truth, and in that acceptance, they find peace. This emotional detachment isn't about closing off to everyone. It's about opening up to themselves. It's a boundary created not from fear, but from knowledge, a promise to themselves to stop bleeding for those who never stop cutting. They guard their emotional world like something sacred, no longer open to anyone careless with it. They aren't punishing anyone. They are protecting their spirit, and that protection becomes their new form of strength. They begin to speak less and notice more. They stop explaining and start choosing. They stop needing praise to know their worth. They no longer accept chaos as the cost of love. Their clarity strengthens their intuition. They see through manipulation. They trust their inner voice. They understand that deep feeling does not require staying connected to pain. That letting go isn't failure, but self-respect. In emotional detachment, the empath doesn't lose their humanity. They reclaim it. They stop carrying burdens that aren't theirs. They stop trying to save people who drag them under. They rise not for revenge, but for renewal. They rise with a clear picture of what they deserve, with a new connection to peace, with a life no longer built around survival, but around growth. They choose clarity over confusion, dignity over despair, healing over harmful habits. The fed-up empath doesn't want revenge. They become untouchable. A unique shift happens when someone who once led with their heart starts leading with their boundaries. It's not an act of anger, it's an act of reclaiming themselves. Empaths naturally desire connection. They want to believe in the goodness in people even when it's hard to see. They give time, space, compassion, and endless chances. But when that kindness is repeatedly answered with lies, manipulation, or coldness, the empath doesn't just get upset, they evolve. At first, they try to make it work. They express their feelings gently, hoping to be heard. They offer understanding. They try to compromise even when they're the only one doing it. But when their sincerity is ignored or twisted, they begin to realize an important truth. Not everyone wants to be healed, not everyone respects honesty, and not everyone deserves their depth. This truth comes slowly, after too many moments of feeling invisible, after late nights overthinking, after forgiving things that never came with any regret, after giving love to people who mistook loyalty for servitude. When the empath reaches their limit, they don't erupt. They don't create drama. They simply unplug from the person and from the fantasy. They stop needing closure. They stop trying to fix what's broken beyond repair. They stop searching for the version of someone who no longer exists. This is where transformation begins. Their focus moves inward. They stop needing approval from people who use their kindness as leverage. They stop relying on validation from those who build control around their emotions. The fed-up empath doesn't need revenge, because the moment they reclaim their peace, they have already won. They begin acting differently, not out of anger, but out of emotional balance. The person who used to react now stays centered. The one who explained everything now values silence. The one who chased connection now treasures solitude. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started protecting what they care about. Their energy becomes precious. Their empathy becomes selective. They no longer allow people to occupy space in their mind without respect. The people who once took advantage of their softness become confused by their calm distance. They may try to provoke or guilt trip them, but nothing works. The fed-up empath doesn't argue or defend. They simply walk away with quiet power. And that calmness terrifies the narcissist more than any anger ever could. Because what a narcissist fears most isn't rage, it's irrelevance. And when the empath is truly done, the narcissist becomes invisible to them. They see through the lies. They ignore the charm. They stop reacting. They leave the game because they've grown past it. This untouchability isn't arrogance. It's emotional maturity. It's knowing the difference between those who lift your spirit and those who drain it. The fed-up empath isn't cold, they're clear. They finally understand that self-love isn't selfish, it's essential, that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors that close behind those who mistreat them. They stop seeing letting go as failure, they see it as freedom. Their silence becomes meaningful, their peace becomes priceless. They reclaim their time, their identity, and their emotional world. Those who once fed off their availability are shocked by their calm strength. The same openness that once made them vulnerable now makes them powerful. They stop absorbing pain and begin observing behavior. They stop waiting for change and start choosing it. They stop hoping others will save them and start saving themselves. They become who they were always meant to be: grounded, wise, confident, and whole. Strength born from suffering is the kind that never kneels again. There is a special kind of resilience that cannot be learned in comfort. It doesn't come from reading or listening. It comes from pain, from lonely nights where doubts feel heavier than the world, from mornings where waking up feels like a victory. This strength doesn't shout. It doesn't need recognition. It quietly exists in every moment someone chooses not to fall apart, even when everything tries to break them. It's the strength shaped not in winning, but in surviving. An empath doesn't just feel their own pain, they absorb the emotional storms of others. They carry tension in rooms, weight in relationships, and silence that feels like screaming. They suffer not only from what others do to them, but from what they keep enduring in hopes of change. Their suffering goes unseen by most. It hides behind smiles, patience, and the desire to protect peace even at their own cost. But under that surface, something powerful is forming. A foundation strengthened by every moment they choose to endure. This suffering doesn't make them bitter. It makes them aware. At first, they doubt themselves. They wonder if they feel too much, if they're too emotional or too complex for the people around them. They question their worth because others fail to mirror it back. But when the pain repeats, when the patterns stay the same, they finally see that the problem was never their depth. It was that others weren't deep enough to meet them. And that insight changes everything. Their inner voice shifts. Instead of asking why they aren't enough, they start asking why they accepted so little. Instead of thinking something is wrong with them, they recognize something was wrong with the environment they adapted to. That is how their transformation begins. When the empath stops seeing their suffering as weightness and starts seeing it as the fire that shaped them, everything changes. Every heartbreak becomes a lesson. Every betrayal becomes direction. Every dismissal becomes a reminder. The strength born from pain isn't loud or aggressive. It simply stands. It stands unshaken in chaos. It stands firm when tested. It stands tall without needing approval. And it never bows again, not to manipulation, guilt, fear, or loneliness, because it knows now that survival was not the end. It was training. Every time they fell and rose again, they learned something about themselves. Every time they were unseen, they learned to see themselves clearly. And the strength created through that journey is untouchable. It doesn't chase revenge. It doesn't need applause. It knows exactly what it's made of. It remembers every moment it felt forgotten and uses that memory as a promise never to abandon itself again. It's the strength that says no without guilt, that leaves quietly without fear, that sets boundaries without apology. It's not hardened. It's refined. It's not cold. It's focused. It's strength that doesn't need to prove anything because it already proved itself in silence. This strength transforms the empath's entire way of living. They still care, but with wisdom. They still feel deeply, but with protection. They still love, but not at the cost of their own well-being. They no longer carry people who refuse to walk beside them. They no longer bleed for those who cause the wounds. They choose themselves first, not because they are selfish, but because they finally recognize no one is coming to rescue them, and they don't need rescuing anymore. That self-reliance becomes their highest power. It's not based on controlling others, but on managing their own energy. It gives them the power to pause before reacting, the power to speak only when necessary, the power to walk alone when the crowd no longer matches their purpose. This strength born from endurance becomes their shield and their flame. It is lasting, it is final, and once it forms, it never bows again.